My second precept is the importance of taking a moral stand. It's, of course, easy when there's no pressure on the other side, but I've been in occasions when there have been pressures, a lot of pressures. When I was chosen as the first president of the Legal Services Corporation, which funds civil legal help for poor people, it was the job I wanted. I was dean at Stanford Law School at the time, but I came to understand there were 34 million poor people in this country at that time, more now, who were totally without access to civil legal help unless they had a legal services lawyer. And I wanted to be part of a brand new organization that would promote that. And we had 6,000 full-time lawyers and 6,000 paralegals, but for 34 million people, that's not very much. So I spent a lot of time talking to private bar associations and asking for their time, their talent, their energies to help give legal services to poor people. And many thousands did so. But I also found that some of the lawyers in the wealthiest firms doing derivatives and all sorts of fancy, high-priced activities would say to me, gee, Tom, I can't do that because I really don't know anything about Social Security law or family law or housing law. And I'd say, don't worry. We have a short course you can take. It will train you easily, and you will do an enormous service to people for whom the loss of a Social Security check may mean they're not just out of the street, but they don't have anything to eat, and it's true disaster. And then all too often, the next response would be, well, I'd like to do that, but they wouldn't be comfortable with me. And it took a little while for me to realize that this was a code for saying I wouldn't be comfortable with them. I wouldn't be comfortable with them, particularly if their skin color was different than my own. It was important to see then that giving help to others was something that one came to learn over time. The earlier the better, but certainly college was a prime time to learn it, and that enabled me to come back to university life committed to promoting civic engagement, service learning courses, programs across the country that helped strengthen. And that was, in my view, a moral imperative. But when I was president, or when I was chosen as president, rather, of the Legal Services Corporation, the board that chose me had half Republicans, half Democrats, and they chose me in part because I hadn't been part of the legal services establishment before. And I was told by the chair of the board that I had complete authority to choose whomever I wanted. And I chose as my deputy the executive vice president, my alter ego, a close friend who had been dean of Catholic Law School, had been head of the legal services when it was part of the Office of Economic Opportunity in the White House. And he was, to me, a perfect partner because legal services lawyers knew him and trusted him in a way that they didn't know or have reason to trust me. But the week before we were to have the formal decision by the board and then the swearing in of myself as president and my colleague Clinton Bamberger as executive vice president, a right-wing columnist named Kirkpatrick wrote a venomous column saying that I was a wild-eyed lefty, but Bamberger was worse. He was pink, and the board at any cost should be sure that he didn't become part of the new Legal Services Corporation. So I went to the luncheon where the board met in executive session, and the idea was they were quickly going to approve us, and then we had invited 500 or so of our closest friends to come to a large gathering where Justice Byron White would swear each of us in, and we give a good start to legal services. Well, the luncheon went on and on and on, and finally the chair of the board, who was dean of the Cornell Law School, came out and said to me, "Tom, the board is split 5-5. There were actually 11 on the board, but one of them was delayed in New Orleans and couldn't get out. 5 of them absolutely refuse to allow Bamberger to be executive vice president. So would you please consider choosing someone else as your executive vice president?" And I felt instantly what the right moral stand was, which was to say, I can't do that. I can't do that, and I've given him my word, but no less important, I believe I can't do the job adequately without him. But I knew in the back of my mind that if we weren't appointed, Legal Services was going to suffer for a time without a president, and there would be real and difficult consequences. Well, we waited and waited and waited, and finally we told, we had a telephone tree and told everybody who was coming to the party to go home. We had mounds of food that we gave away, and we went back to Bamberger's house, and finally at 10 o'clock at night, the 11th board member came, voted for us, and we were approved the next morning 6-5. Well, you might think being approved 6-5 is not exactly the best way to start your experience as a leader of the Legal Services Corporation, but in fact, after that, the board was really united. They somehow felt we've gone through something, it's over, now let's get together and really work together, and they did. And it was a great experience thereafter. But it is hard to take a moral stand when the precept that I've articulated clashes with competing claims. Loyalty to a colleague is one, and there have been times when I thought the loyalty to the colleague just outweighed a misdeed that she or he might have done. But my toughest issue by far was in my first year as president of Indiana University. The Indiana basketball team, under its coach, Bob Knight, had just won the national championship. For 17 years, my predecessor had never sanctioned him. I criticized him in the fall for pulling the team off the field when he didn't like what the referee was doing in an exhibition game. and he was furious at me for that. But in the springtime, in May, he was being interviewed by a commentator named Connie Chung. Some of you who are of a certain age will remember her. She came down on courtside, and it was being filmed for about 3 hours, and she was talking dirty to him the entire time. This was a man who had the foulest tongue I've ever known. He was a bully. He was a misogynist. He was, though, an extraordinary coach for those players who could survive his mode because they really played remarkably well. But he was the absolute antithesis of a role model in every way. And she was talking to him, and at one point he said to her, "Well, Connie, it's like rape. If you can't do anything about it, spread your legs and enjoy it." Well, you can't imagine that within an hour, that clip was on national news throughout the country. Not just women's groups, but groups from all over the country were screaming, understandably. I tried to call him to find at least what he wanted to say. I couldn't reach him. He had gone underground, no surprise. But I went on nightly news and said this was a despicable thing to say. It did not represent Indiana University. It was an outrageous comment, and I was ashamed that it was said by someone representing the university. Knight was furious. He was furious at me, but he was particularly furious that he had been snookered by a woman, Connie Chung. And almost at the same time, the president of University of New Mexico had a search started for a new basketball coach. And as it happened, Bob Knight had a ranch in fishing ranch in New Mexico, and the president of the university sent his plane up to take Bob Knight down to see if he wouldn't come and be coached down there where he would be a little more loved than he was by the president of Indiana University. Well, the whole place exploded. I got 10,000 letters. As you might imagine, those from inside Indiana were overwhelmingly in favor of Knight. One I particularly cherished and put on my wall said, "I'm an 87-year-old woman. I live for Indiana University basketball. You can," I used to wear bow ties only, "you could take your goddamn bow tie and go back east where you belong." Letters from outside the university, outside Indiana, were much more on my side, and particularly the faculty was almost unanimously. But I did have a moral issue because he was the worst of a role model. But on the other hand, I had a huge academic agenda that I had underway. And I knew with a high degree of certainty that if I told him goodbye, that everything would grind to a halt. I knew it in part because The year before, one of my good friends was president of the University of Iowa, Hunter Rawlings, later president of Cornell, and he announced that he was going to eliminate freshman eligibility, and which I happen to think would have been a good idea, but he said it, we're going to do it, and the whole university ground to a halt, while alumni, fans of the program screamed and yelled, and he couldn't get anything done. And I was quite sure the same thing would happen to me. And so, not without great misgivings, having publicly rebuked him, I nonetheless told him I wanted him to stay, which was not exactly the moral stand, but it seemed at the time essential.